What if one of the world's most popular sports has two completely different names depending on where you live? And both names actually make sense. In most countries, it's called football. But in the United States, it's soccer. Why this difference? The answer isn't because Americans are stubborn or confused. It's a fascinating story of language, history, and two very different sports that both wanted to be called football. Welcome to Story Behind the Things, the channel where we uncover the fascinating stories behind the everyday things, words, and ideas that shape our world. Today, we explain why Americans say soccer while the rest of the world calls it football. Let's start with the obvious. The sport we're talking about is played with a round ball using mostly your feet. And it's the most popular sport on Earth. In Brazil, England, Spain, Germany, Argentina, pretty much everywhere. People call it football. That name makes perfect sense. You kick the ball with your foot. So why do Americans call it soccer? The story begins in England in the mid-1800s. At that time, different schools and clubs played various versions of football. Some allowed players to pick up the ball and run with it, others focused more on kicking. This created confusion. In 1863, a group of clubs in London met and created clear rules for what they called association football. Association referred to the Football Association, the FA that organized the sport. To make things shorter and easier, people started calling it a sock football. Over time, this turned into a soccer, and eventually just soccer. At the same time, another version of the game that allowed carrying the ball became known as rugby football, named after rugby school. People shortened that to rugger. For a while in England, both football and soccer were used for the kicking game. But gradually, football became the main name in Britain and spread around the world. Now let's cross the Atlantic to America. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, a very different sport was growing popular in American colleges. This sport allowed players to carry, throw, and run with an oval-shaped ball. It also came from older versions of English football but evolved into what we now call American football. Because this new sport was so popular in the United States, people simply started calling it football. When the round ball kicking game arrived in America, it needed a different name so people wouldn't get confused between the two sports. That's when soccer became the common term in the US and Canada. The main reason is simple. Language and history created two sports that both claimed the name football. America already had its own football, so it kept the older British nickname soccer for the world's game. This difference stuck even though the rest of the world standardized on football. Interestingly, some other countries also use soccer officially sometimes, for example, in Australia to distinguish from Australian rules football, and in parts of South Africa and Canada. Today, the global governing body is still called FIFA, Fédération Internationale de Football Association, using the word football. But in the United States, the official organization is called the United States Soccer Federation. Here are some interesting facts most people don't know. First, the word soccer is actually British in origin, not American. It was invented in England in the late 1800s. Second, in the early 1900s, some Americans tried to call their gridiron game gridiron or American rugby to avoid confusion, but football won out. Third, even today in England, older people sometimes still use soccer without thinking twice, though football is dominant. Fourth, the confusion is so common that when Major League Soccer (MLS) started in the US, they deliberately used soccer in the name to make it clear. And fifth, many American athletes who play the round ball game professionally in Europe happily switch to calling it football while they're there. In simple terms, Americans say soccer because their country already had a popular sport called football. The rest of the world calls it football because that's the original and most logical name for a game played mainly with the feet. Both names are correct in their own way. It's a perfect example of how language evolves differently in different places. Words aren't always logical. They carry the history of the people who use them. The next time someone teases Americans for saying soccer, you can now explain the real reason with confidence. It's not that Americans don't understand the game, it's that they already had their own football. Thank you for watching this clear explanation of why Americans say soccer. If you enjoyed learning about everyday words and cultural differences in simple language, don't forget to subscribe to Story Behind the Things for more easy-to-understand videos about the world around us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.